The very fact that you have weekly family time says 100-fold that family is truly important. So even though someone may be flaky or duplicitous and someone else may be lazy, the setting up of these structures and processes compensates for most, though not all, of those human deficiencies. It builds the principles into the patterns and structures that people can depend on. And the results are similar to those that happen when you go on a vacation. A family may have emotional ups and downs on a vacation, but the fact that they went on a vacation together and that it was renewing a tradition builds the principles into the culture. It frees the family from always being dependent on good example. Again, in the words of sociologist Emil Durkheim, when mores are sufficient, laws are unnecessary. When mores are insufficient, laws are unenforceable. In adapting this to the family, we might say, when mores are sufficient, family rules are unnecessary. When mores are insufficient, family rules are unenforceable. Ultimately, if people won't support the patterns and structures, then you'll see instability enter the family, and the family may even struggle for survival. But if these patterns become habits, they become strong enough to subordinate individual weaknesses that manifest themselves from time to time. For example, you may not begin a one-on-one or family time with the best of feelings, but if you spend the entire evening doing some fun thing together, you'll probably end with the best of feelings. This is one of the most powerful things that I have learned in my professional work with organizations. You must build the principles into the structures and systems so that they become part of the culture itself. Then you are no longer dependent on a few people at the top. I've seen situations in which an entire top management team moved into another company, but because of the deep bench strength in the culture, there was hardly a blip in the economic and social performance of the organization. This is one of the great insights of W. Edwards Deming, a guru in the field of quality and management, and one of the key reasons for Japan's past economic success. The problem is not in bad people, it's in bad processes, bad structures and systems. That is why we give such energy to this organizing role. Without some basic organizing, it's easy for family members to become like ships that pass in the night. So the third level of this tree, depicted by the trunk breaking out into the larger and then smaller limbs, represents your role as an organizer. This is where people experience how the principles are built into the patterns and structures of everyday life, so that not only do you say that family is important, but they experience it in frequent meals together, family times, and meaningful one-on-ones. Soon they come to trust these family structures and patterns. They can depend on them, and this gives them a sense of security and order and predictability. By organizing around your deepest priorities, you're creating alignment and order. You're setting up systems and structures that support, rather than get in the way of, what you're trying to do. Organizing becomes an enabler, literally transforming restraining factors into driving or enabling factors on the path from survival to significance. When one of our sons started junior high school, he began coming home with poor test scores. Sandra took him aside and said, "Look, I know you're not dumb. What seems to be the problem?" "I don't know," he mumbled. "Well," she said, "let's see if we can't do something to help you." After dinner, they sat down together and went over some of the tests. As they talked, Sandra began to realize that this boy wasn't reading the instructions carefully before taking the tests. Furthermore, he didn't know how to outline a book, and there were several other gaps in his knowledge and understanding. So they began to spend an hour together every evening working on reading, outlining books, and understanding instructions. By the end of the semester, he had gone from 40% test scores to all A's and 1 A+. When his brother saw his report card on the fridge, he said, "You mean that's your report card? You must be some kind of a genius." I am convinced that part of the reason Sandra was able to have that kind of influence at that time in his life is because of her modeling, mentoring, and organizing. She placed a high value on education, and everyone in the family knew it. She had a great relationship with this son. She had spent hours and hours with him over the years, building the emotional bank account and doing things he enjoyed. And she organized her time so that she could be with him to help him in this way. These teaching moments are some of the supreme moments of family life, those incomparable times when you know you've made a significant difference in the life of another family member. This is the point at which your efforts help empower family members so that they develop the internal capacity and skill to live effectively. And this is at the heart of what parenting and family are all about. Maria, daughter. I'll never forget an experience I had with my mother many years ago when I was a teenager. My father was away on a business trip, and it was my turn to stay up late with Mom. We made hot chocolate, chatted for a while, and then got comfortable in her big bed in time to watch a rerun of Starsky and Hutch. She was a few months pregnant at the time, and while we were watching TV, she got up abruptly and ran to the bathroom, where she stayed for a long time. After a while, I realized that something was wrong as I heard her quietly weeping in the bathroom. I went in to find her with her nightgown covered in blood. She had just had a miscarriage. When she saw me come in, she stopped crying and explained to me in a matter-of-fact way what had happened. She assured me that she was fine. She said that sometimes babies aren't fully formed the way they should be, and this was for the best. I remember taking comfort in her words, and together we cleaned up and then went back to bed. Now that I'm a mother, I am amazed at how my mother was able to subordinate what must have been heart-wrenching emotions into a learning experience for her teenage daughter. Instead of wallowing in her grief, which would have been the natural thing to do, she cared more about my feelings than her own and turned what could have been a traumatic experience for me into a positive one. Thus, the fourth level of the tree, the leaves and the fruit, represents your role as a teacher. This means that you explicitly teach others the primary laws of life. You teach empowering principles so that as people understand them and live by them, they come to trust those principles and trust themselves because they have integrity. Having integrity means their lives are integrated around a balanced set of principles that are universal, timeless, and self-evident. When people see good examples or models, feel loved, and have good experiences, then they will hear what is taught. And the likelihood is very high that they will live what they hear so that they too become examples and models and even teachers for other people to see and trust. And this beautiful cycle begins again. This kind of teaching creates conscious competence. People can be unconsciously incompetent. They can be completely ineffective and not even know it. Or they can be consciously incompetent. They know they're ineffective, but don't have the internal desire or discipline to create needed change. Or they can be unconsciously competent. They're effective, but don't know why. They're living out positive scripts they've been handed by others. They can teach by example, but not by precept because they don't understand it. Or they can be consciously competent. They know what they're doing and why it works. Then they can teach by both precept and example. It's this level of conscious competence that enables people to effectively pass knowledge and skill from one generation to another. Your role as a teacher in creating conscious competence in your children is absolutely irreplaceable. As we said in Habit 3, if you do not teach them, society will. And that is what will mold and shape them and their future. Now, if you've done your own interior work so that you are modeling these primary laws of life, if you've built relationships of trust by living the primary laws of love, and if you've done the organizational work, having regular family times and one-on-ones, then this teaching will be much, much easier. What you teach will essentially come out of your mission statement. It will be the principles and values that you have determined to be supremely important. And let me tell you here, to pay no attention to people who say you shouldn't teach values until your children are old enough to choose their own. That statement itself is a should statement that represents a value system. There is no such thing as value-free living or value-free teaching. Everything is hinged and infused in values. You therefore have to decide what your values are and what you want to live by, and since you have a sacred stewardship with these children, what you want them to live by as well. Get them into the wisdom literature. Expose them to the deepest thoughts and noblest feelings of the human heart and mind. Teach them how to recognize the whisperings of conscience and to be faithful and truthful even when others are not. When you teach will be a function of the needs of family members, the family times and one-on-ones you set up, and those serendipitous teaching moments that present themselves as wonderful gifts to the parent who is watching for opportunity and is aware. With regard to teaching, I would offer 4 suggestions. 1. Discern the overall situation. When people feel threatened, an effort to teach by precept or telling will generally increase the resentment toward both the teacher and the teaching. It's often better to wait for or create a new situation in which the person is in a secure and receptive frame of mind. Your forbearance in not scolding or correcting in the emotionally charged moment will communicate and teach respect and understanding. In other words, when you can't teach one value by precept, you can teach another by example. And example teaching is infinitely more powerful and lasting than precept teaching. Combining both, of course, is even better. 2. Sense your own spirit and attitude. If you're angry and frustrated, you can't avoid communicating this regardless of the logic of your words or the value of the principle you're trying to teach. Restrain yourself or distance yourself. Teach at another time when you have feelings of affection, respect, and inward security. A good rule of thumb: if you can gently touch or hold the arm or hand of your son or daughter while correcting or teaching, and you both feel comfortable with this, you'll have a positive influence. You simply cannot do this in an angry mood. 3. Distinguish between the time to teach and the time to give help and support. To rush in with preachments and success formulas when your spouse or child is emotionally fatigued or under a lot of pressure is comparable to trying to teach a drowning man to swim. He needs a rope or a helping hand, not a lecture. 4. Realize that, in a larger sense, we are teaching one thing or another all the time because we are constantly radiating what we are. Always remember that, as with modeling and mentoring, you cannot not teach. Your own character and example, the relationship you have with your children, and the priorities that are served by your organization or lack of it in the home, make you your children's first and most influential teacher. Their learning or their ignorance of life's most vital lessons is largely in your hands. In the following principle-centered family leadership model, you will see the 4 roles: modeling, mentoring, organizing, and teaching. In the left column, notice how the 4 basic universal needs to live, physical or economic, to love, social, to learn, mental, and to leave a legacy, spiritual, relate to those 4 roles. Remember, too, the 5th need in the family, to laugh and have fun. Notice in the right column how the 4 unique human gifts also relate to the 4 roles. Modeling is essentially the spiritual. It draws primarily upon conscience for its energy and direction. Mentoring is essentially the social and draws primarily upon self-awareness as manifested in respecting others, understanding others, empathizing, and synergizing with others. Organizing is essentially the physical and taps into the independent as well as the social will to organize time and life, to set up a family mission statement, weekly family times, and one-on-ones. Teaching is primarily mental. The mind is the steering wheel of life as we are guided into a future that we create first in our minds through the power of our imagination. In fact, the gifts are cumulative at every level, so that mentoring involves conscience and self-awareness, organizing involves conscience, self-awareness, and willpower, and teaching involves conscience, self-awareness, willpower, and imagination. As you look at these 4 leadership roles and how they relate to the 4 basic human needs and the 4 human gifts, you can see how fulfilling them well will enable you to create change in the family. You model. Family members see your example and learn to trust you. You mentor. Family members feel your unconditional love and begin to value themselves. You organize. Family members experience order in their lives and grow to trust the structure that meets their basic needs. You teach. Family members hear and do. They experience the results and learn to trust principles and themselves. As you do these things, you exercise leadership and influence in your family. If you do them in a sound, principle-centered way, by modeling, you create trustworthiness. By mentoring, you create trust. By organizing, you create alignment and order. By teaching, you create empowerment. The important thing to realize is that no matter where you are on the destination chart, you are doing all of these things anyway. You may be modeling the struggle for survival, goal setting, or contribution. You may be mentoring by putting people down, rewarding success with conditional love, or loving unconditionally. The organization in your family may be a system of repeated disorganization, or you may have calendars, job charts, rules, or even a family mission statement. Informally or formally, you may be teaching anything from disrespect for the law to honesty, integrity, and service. The point is that, like it or not, you are a leader in your family, and one way or another you are already fulfilling each of these roles. The question is how you are fulfilling them. Can you fulfill them in a way that will help you create the kind of family you want to create? For many years now, I have asked audiences this question. If you were to do one thing you know would make a tremendous difference for good in your personal life, what would that one thing be? I then ask them the same question with regard to their professional or work life. People come up with answers very easily. Deep inside, they already know what they need to do. Then I ask them to examine their answers and determine whether what they wrote down is urgent or important or both. Urgent comes from the outside, from environmental pressures and crises. Important comes from the inside, from their own deep value system. Almost without exception, the things people write down that would make a tremendous positive difference in their lives are important but not urgent. As we talk about it, people come to realize that the reason they don't do these things is that they're not urgent, they're not pressing, and unfortunately, most people are addicted to the urgent. In fact, if they're not being driven by the urgent, they feel guilty. They feel as if something is wrong. But truly effective people in all walks of life focus on the important rather than the merely urgent. Research shows that worldwide, the most successful executives focus on importance, and less effective executives focus on urgency. Sometimes the urgent is also important, but much of the time it is not. Clearly, a focus on what is truly important is far more effective than a focus on what is merely urgent. It's true in all walks of life, including the family. Of course, parents are going to have to deal with crises and with putting out fires that are both important and urgent. But when they proactively choose to spend more time on things that are truly important, but not necessarily urgent, it reduces the crises and fires. Just think about some of the important things that have been suggested in this book. Building an emotional bank account, creating personal, marriage, and family mission statements, having weekly family times, having one-on-one dates with family members, creating family traditions, working together, learning together, and worshiping together. These things are not urgent. They don't press on us in the same way as urgent matters such as rushing to the hospital to be with a child who has overdosed on drugs, responding to an emotionally hurting spouse who has just asked for a divorce, or trying to deal with a child who wants to drop out of school. But the whole point is that by choosing to spend time on important things, we decrease the number and intensity of true emergencies in our family life. Many issues are talked over and worked out well in advance of their becoming a problem. The relationships are there. The structures are there. People can talk things over, work things out. Teaching is taking place. The focus is on fire prevention instead of putting out fires. As Benjamin Franklin summarized it, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. The reality is that most families are overmanaged and underled. But the more quality leadership that is provided in the family, the less management is needed because people will manage themselves, and vice versa. The less leadership is provided, the more management is needed, because without a common vision and common value system, you have to control things and people to keep them in line. This requires external management, but it also stirs up rebellion or it breaks people's spirit. Again, as it says in Proverbs, where there is no vision, the people perish. This is where the 7 habits come in. They empower you to exercise leadership as well as management in the family, to do the important as well as the urgent and important. They help you build relationships. They help you teach your family the natural laws that govern in all of life and together institutionalize those laws into a mission statement and some enabling structures. Without question, family life today is a high-wire trapeze act with no safety net. Only through principle-centered leadership can you provide a net in the form of moral authority in the culture itself, and simultaneously build the mindset and the skill set to perform the necessary acrobatics required. The 7 habits help you fulfill your natural family leadership roles in the principle-based ways that create stability, success, and significance. People often make one of 3 common mistakes with regard to the principle-centered family leadership tree. The first mistake is to think that each role is sufficient in and of itself. Many people seem to think that modeling alone is sufficient, that if you persist and set a good example long enough, children will eventually follow that example. These people see no real need for mentoring, organizing, or teaching. Others feel that mentoring or loving is all sufficient, that if you build a relationship and constantly communicate love, it will cover a multitude of sins in the area of personal example and render organizational structure and teaching unnecessary, even counterproductive. Love is seen as the panacea, the answer to everything. Some are convinced that proper organizing, which includes planning and setting up structures and systems to make good things happen in relationships and in family life, is sufficient. Their families may be well managed, but they lack leadership. They may be proceeding correctly, but in the wrong direction. Or they're full of excellent systems and checklists for everybody, but have no heart, no warmth, no feeling. Children will tend to move away from these situations as soon as possible and may not desire to return, except perhaps out of a sense of family duty or a strong spiritual desire to make some changes. Others feel that the role of parents is basically to teach by way of telling, and that explaining more clearly and consistently will eventually work. If it doesn't work, it at least transfers responsibility to the children. Some feel that setting the example and relating, in other words, modeling and mentoring, are all that is necessary. Others feel that modeling, mentoring, and teaching will suffice, and organizing is not that important because, in the long run, it's relationship that really counts. This analysis could go on, but it essentially revolves around the idea that we don't really need all 4 of these roles, that only 1 or 2 is sufficient. But this is a major and a very common mistake. Each role is necessary, but absolutely insufficient without the other 3. For example, you might be a good person and have a good relationship, but without organization and teaching, there will be no structural and systemic reinforcement when you are not present or when something happens that negatively affects your relationship. Children need not only to see it and feel it, but also to experience it and hear it, or they may never understand the important laws of life that govern happiness and success. The second mistake, which is even more common, is to ignore the sequence, to think that you can explicitly teach without having the relationship. or that you can build a good relationship without being a trustworthy person, or that verbal teaching is sufficient and that the principles and laws of life contained in this verbal teaching do not need to be embodied into the patterns and process, the structures and systems of everyday family life. But just as the leaves on the tree grow out of the branches grow out of the limbs grow out of the trunk, and the trunk grows out of the roots, so each of these leadership roles grows out of those that precede it. In other words, there is an order here: model, mentor, organize, teach, that represents the true inside-out process. Just as the roots of the tree bring nutrients and life to every other part of the tree, so your own example gives life to your relationships, to your efforts to organize, to your opportunities to teach. Truly, your modeling is the foundation of every other part of the tree, and every other level is a necessary part of those that grow out of it. Effective family leaders recognize this order, and whenever there's a breakdown, use the sequence to help diagnose the source of the problem and take the steps necessary to resolve it. In Greek philosophy, human influence comes from ethos, pathos, logos. Ethos basically means credibility that comes from example. Pathos comes from the relationship, the emotional alignment, the understanding that is taking place between people, and the respect they have for one another. And logos deals with logic, the logic of life, the lessons of life. As with the 7 habits, the sequence and the synergy are the important things. People do not hear if they do not feel and see. The logic of life will not take root if you don't care or if you lack credibility. The third mistake is to think that when you have fulfilled these roles once, you don't have to do them anymore. In other words, to look at fulfilling these roles as an event rather than as an ongoing process. Model, mentor, organize, and teach are present tense verbs that must continually take place. They must go on day in and day out. Modeling, or example, must always be there, including the example of apologizing when we get off course. We must continually make deposits in the emotional bank account because yesterday's meal does not satisfy today's hunger, especially in family relationships where expectations are high. Because circumstances are constantly changing, there is always the role of organizing to accommodate that changing reality so that the principles are institutionalized and adapted to the situation. And explicit teaching must constantly go on because people are continually moving from one level of development to another, and the same principles apply differently at different levels of development. In addition, because of changing circumstances and age and stage realities, new principles apply and come into play that must be taught and reinforced. In our own family, we've discovered that each child represents his or her own unique challenge, unique world, and unique needs. Each represents a whole new level of commitment and energy and vision. We even sensed with our last child, out of nostalgia for the past glorious years of raising a family, a tendency to overindulge. Perhaps this comes from our own need to be needed, even though our mission statement focuses on producing independence and interdependence. Joshua, son. Being the youngest of 9 has its advantages. The older kids are always complaining and moaning to mom and dad that I'm spoiled and get away with murder. They say that mom and dad aren't half as strict as they used to be, that I don't have to work and slave like they did. They ask, what do you do anyway besides pick up your room and take out the garbage? They tell me that when they were growing up, it was harder to become an Eagle Scout. Their school teachers were meaner and tougher, and mom and dad weren't nearly as well off. They complain that while they have to stay home and put food on the table, I get to go on trips. The boys say they used to lift weights and work out and have muscles, but now they have to be responsible, and that's why they can't beat me in a game of tennis or basketball anymore. They say I'd better buckle down and get straight A's if I want to get into a good college, and I'll never go to graduate school if I read Cliff's Notes instead of doing my own thinking. They tell me that's why I should listen to their advice and not make the same mistakes they did. They also say for sure I'll get to go pro in whatever sport I choose, because they've all offered to train me. And if I just do what they say, my life will be a lot easier than they had it. Even as I write this book, I find myself increasingly grateful for the significance of the airplane metaphor and the opportunity to constantly change and improve, and to apply what I'm trying to teach. This has been a forceful reminder to me that we need to keep on keeping on, to endure to the end, and respect the laws that govern growth, development, and happiness in all of life. Otherwise, we become like the well-intended person who, seeing a butterfly struggling to come out of its cocoon, wildly swinging its wings to break the one small tendon that holds it to the old form, the old structure, out of a spirit of helpfulness, takes a penknife and cuts the remaining tendon. As a result, the butterfly's wings never fully develop, and the butterfly dies. So we must never think that our work is done with our children, our grandchildren, even our great-grandchildren. Once in the Florida Keys, I spoke to a group of extremely wealthy retired couples about the importance of the three-generational family. They acknowledged they had essentially compartmentalized their sense of responsibility to their grown children and their grandchildren. Family involvement was not the central force in their lives. It was an occasional, holidays-only guilt reliever justified by the rationale of helping the kids to become independent from them. But as they opened up and leveled, many acknowledged their sadness in this compartmentalization, even abdication, and resolved to become engaged with their families in a number of new ways. Helping our children become independent is important, of course, but this kind of compartmentalized attitude will never create the intergenerational family support system that is needed today to deal with the onslaught of the culture on the nuclear family. Families often get caught in one of two extremes. Either they become too enmeshed, that is, too emotionally dependent upon one another, and perhaps socially, financially, or intellectually dependent as well, or perhaps through fear of dependence, they become too detached, too independent. This is actually a kind of counterdependence. Sometimes families cultivate independent lifestyles that have the appearance of interdependence, even though deep within there is profound dependence. Usually, you can distinguish between such dependence and true interdependence by listening to the language. People are either in a blaming and accusing mode, or they focus on the future and opportunities and responsibilities. Only as family members really pay the price by winning the private victory and producing a genuine and balanced independence can they begin to work on the issues of interdependence. With regard to our own intergenerational family, Sandra and I have concluded that the responsibility of being grandparents is secondary to that of being parents. In other words, we have defined our primary job as that of affirming our own children and the job they're doing with their children.